Saturday mornings meant waking to sounds from your grandmother's kitchen, the sizzle of something frying.
The mornings were always busy back then. Biscuits, gravy, and apples on the stove.
The clink of dishes being set, smells that pulled you from bed before anyone called your name. In 1950s, 30 breakfast recipes filled morning tables nationwide. By 1965, families made 12. Today, most make 2, scrambled eggs and toast. These weren't just meals, they were morning rituals proving breakfast deserved the same care as dinner. Tonight, we document all 30 before the last grandmothers who cooked them die. Walk into any 1950s kitchen on Saturday morning, and you'd find grandmothers making creamed eggs, hard-boiled eggs in white sauce served over toast. This economical breakfast cost about 25 cents and fed 4 people with eggs that were more elegant than scrambled, but just as filling. Grandmothers made creamed eggs by hard-boiling eggs, peeling and chopping them, then stirring them into white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. The sauce had to be smooth and properly thickened. Lumpy sauce announced amateur cooking, requiring constant stirring while adding milk gradually. The creamed eggs were poured over toast points, creating breakfast that looked fancy despite simple ingredients. The white sauce made the eggs rich and satisfying, transforming plain hard-boiled eggs into something that seemed special enough for Sunday breakfast or when company stayed overnight. Codfish cakes brought fish to breakfast tables through salt cod mixed with mashed potatoes and fried until golden. This traditional breakfast cost about 40 cents and fed 4 people with protein-rich cakes that were substantial enough to keep you full until lunch. Grandmothers made codfish cakes by soaking salt cod overnight to remove excess salt, flaking the fish, and mixing it with mashed potatoes, eggs, and seasonings, forming the mixture into patties, and frying them in butter or bacon grease. The soaking was essential. Unsoaked salt cod was inedibly salty. The cakes were served with ketchup or white sauce, creating savory breakfast that was different from sweet pancakes or toast. The fish provided protein that made the breakfast substantial and filling, demonstrating that breakfast didn't have to be sweet or grain-based to be satisfying. Cinnamon toast elevated plain toast through butter, cinnamon, and sugar broiled until bubbly and caramelized. This simple treat cost about 10 cents and created breakfast that felt special despite requiring only 4 ingredients and 5 minutes. Grandmothers made cinnamon toast by buttering bread slices, sprinkling them with cinnamon sugar, then placing them under the broiler until the sugar melted and caramelized. The broiling created slightly crispy, sweet-spiced toast that was more interesting than plain buttered toast. The toast had to be watched carefully. The sugar could burn in seconds if left unattended. The brief broiling time required attention, but created results that made plain toast seem celebratory and special, perfect for Saturday morning breakfast when there was time to stand at the oven and watch. Broiled grapefruit transformed tart citrus into sweet breakfast treat through sugar broiled until caramelized and bubbly. This elegant starter cost about 20 cents and created breakfast course that felt sophisticated and special. Grandmothers made broiled grapefruit by cutting grapefruit in half, loosening the sections with a knife, sprinkling each half with sugar and sometimes a dot of butter, then broiling until the sugar melted and caramelized. The brief broiling created sweet, slightly bitter breakfast that was refreshing and palate-cleansing. The grapefruit had to be watched carefully during broiling. The sugar could burn quickly, creating bitter taste instead of pleasant caramelization. The timing required attention but only took a few minutes, making broiled grapefruit practical for special breakfasts when presentation mattered. Baked apples brought fruit to breakfast through apples cored and filled with butter, sugar, and cinnamon, then baked until tender. This simple creation cost about 25 cents and created breakfast side or light main course that was warming and satisfying. Grandmothers made baked apples by coring whole apples without cutting all the way through the bottom, filling the cavity with mixture of butter, brown sugar, and cinnamon, placing them in a baking dish with a little water, and baking until the apples were tender and the filling had melted into sweet sauce. The apples had to be the right variety, firm apples like Rome or Jonathan that held their shape during baking rather than turning to mush. The variety choice separated grandmothers who understood apples from those who just used whatever was available. Hook, 5 breakfasts down, 25 ahead, hard-boiled eggs becoming elegant, salt cod transforming into cakes, plain toast caramelizing, grapefruit sweetening under heat, apples baking until tender. These grandmothers understood that breakfast wasn't just fuel, it was the day's foundation, the morning gathering, the meal that set everything in motion. 25 more recipes reveal their complete morning repertoire. Eggs. Goldenrod brought elegant presentation to breakfast through hard-boiled eggs separated into whites and yolks, creating dish that looked fancy despite simple ingredients. This impressive creation cost about 30 cents and demonstrated how presentation could elevate ordinary eggs into something special. Grandmothers made eggs goldenrod by hard-boiling eggs, separating the whites from the yolks, chopping the whites and stirring them into white sauce, then pouring the mixture over toast and grating the yolks over the top. The golden yolk snow on white sauce created visual appeal that made the dish seem sophisticated. The dish required patience. Separating cooked yolks from whites without breaking them took gentle hands and attention. The yolks had to be pressed through a fine sieve or grater to create the fluffy, snow-like texture that gave the dish its name. Creamed chipped beef on toast, affectionately called SOS by military families, brought dried beef to breakfast tables through white sauce served over toast. This economical breakfast cost about 40 cents and fed 4 people with beef that was preserved through drying and salting, requiring no refrigeration. Grandmothers made creamed chipped beef by tearing dried beef into pieces, rinsing it briefly to remove excess salt, then stirring it into white sauce and serving over toast. The beef had to be rinsed, but not soaked. Too much rinsing removed all the flavor along with the salt. The dish was filling and substantial, providing protein that kept you satisfied through morning. The salty beef flavored the mild white sauce, creating savory breakfast that was different from sweet options. Creamed chipped beef appeared frequently in households where the dried beef's long shelf life made it practical, where grandmothers understood that preserved meats were economical, and where military service had introduced families to the dish that became comfort food despite, or perhaps because of, its humble origins and unfortunate nickname. Baked eggs in tomato cups brought individual servings to breakfast through eggs baked inside hollowed tomatoes. This elegant creation cost about 50 cents and created breakfast that looked restaurant quality despite being made at home. Grandmothers made baked eggs in tomato cups by cutting the tops off large tomatoes, scooping out the insides, cracking an egg into each tomato shell, seasoning with salt and pepper, and baking until the eggs set. The tomato provided edible container that flavored the egg as it cooked. The timing was critical. The eggs had to cook long enough to set, but not so long they became hard and rubbery. The tomatoes also had to be large and firm enough to hold their shape during baking without collapsing. Baked eggs in tomato cups appeared at special breakfasts when presentation mattered, when grandmothers wanted to impress overnight guests or create memorable Sunday breakfast. Popovers brought dramatic presentation to breakfast through hollow rolls that puffed up spectacularly during baking. This impressive creation cost about 30 cents and produced a dozen popovers that looked like magic had happened in the oven. Grandmothers made popovers by mixing eggs, milk, flour, and salt into thin batter, pouring it into very hot, well-greased popover pans or muffin tins, then baking at high heat until the popovers rose dramatically and turned golden brown. The high heat and hot pans were essential. Without them, popovers stayed flat instead of puffing. The popovers had to be served immediately from the oven. They deflated as they cooled, losing the dramatic height that made them impressive. This timing requirement meant popovers appeared at leisurely breakfasts, when everyone could sit down together and eat them fresh from the oven. Homemade sausage patties brought fresh pork to breakfast through ground pork mixed with spices and formed into patties. This economical creation cost about 50 cents and created sausage that tasted fresher and better than store-bought because grandmothers controlled the seasoning and fat content. Grandmothers made sausage patties by mixing ground pork with sage, thyme, salt, pepper, and sometimes a little brown sugar, forming the mixture into flat patties, and frying them until cooked through and browned on both sides. The sage was essential. Without it, the patties were just seasoned pork rather than sausage. The patties had to be cooked thoroughly to ensure the pork was safe to eat, requiring patience and proper heat that cooked them through without burning the outside. The thorough cooking created crispy exterior and juicy interior. Rehook 10 breakfasts down, 20 remaining. Eggs becoming golden snow. Dried beef creating comfort. Tomatoes serving as edible bowls. Hollow rolls puffing dramatically. Ground pork becoming sausage. Every dish required technique. Separating, rinsing, timing, high heat, proper seasoning, proving that breakfast excellence came from knowledge, not just ingredients. 20 more recipes complete the morning table. Fried cornmeal mush transformed leftover breakfast porridge into new dish through slicing and frying, creating breakfast that was both economical and satisfying. This practical creation cost almost nothing because it used mush made the day before. Grandmothers made fried mush by cooking cornmeal with water and salt until thick, pouring it into a loaf pan to cool overnight, then slicing the firm mush and frying the slices in bacon grease or butter until golden and crispy on both sides. The frying transformed soft, plain mush into something with textural interest and rich flavor. The mush was served with syrup or molasses, creating sweet breakfast that was filling and economical. The crispy exterior and soft interior created textural contrast that made simple cornmeal interesting and appealing. The dish represented practical cooking that wasted nothing and that turned yesterday's porridge into today's crispy breakfast through simple frying. Baked grapefruit with honey brought warm citrus to breakfast through grapefruit baked with honey and butter until heated through and slightly caramelized. This warming creation cost about 30 cents and created breakfast that was different from cold, raw grapefruit, gentler, sweeter, more comforting. Grandmothers made baked grapefruit by cutting grapefruit in half, loosening the sections, drizzling honey over each half, dotting with butter, then baking at moderate heat until the grapefruit was heated through and the honey had melted into the fruit. The baking softened the grapefruit's tartness and created warm, comforting fruit. The honey had to be real honey. Corn syrup didn't create the same complex sweetness and floral notes that real honey provided. The butter added richness that made the grapefruit more satisfying and substantial, and that simple preparations could create results that seemed special. The warm grapefruit represented 1950s creativity in breakfast preparation, showing that traditional foods could be adapted through different cooking methods to create new experiences and appeal to different preferences and seasons. Eggs in Purgatory brought Italian tradition to American breakfast through eggs poached in spicy tomato sauce. This flavorful creation cost about 35 cents and fed 4 people with eggs that were savory and interesting, completely different from plain fried or scrambled eggs. Grandmothers made eggs in purgatory by simmering tomato sauce, seasoned with garlic, red pepper flakes, and herbs, making wells in the sauce, cracking eggs into the wells, covering the pan, and cooking until the eggs set. The tomato sauce flavored the eggs as they cooked, creating savory breakfast. The eggs had to be cooked gently, or the yolks would overcook and become hard. The covered pan created steam that cooked the tops of the eggs, while the bottoms cooked in the hot sauce, requiring no flipping and creating eggs that were tender and perfectly cooked. Eggs in purgatory appeared in Italian-American households where the dish was traditional, and in households where grandmothers had learned about it from Italian neighbors and appreciated its bold flavors. The dish taught that breakfast could be spicy and savory, that eggs could be cooked in sauce rather than just in fat, and that ethnic traditions brought variety to American breakfast tables. The name purgatory referred to the spicy red sauce, suggesting that the eggs were suffering in the fiery tomatoes, creating playful religious reference that made the dish memorable and gave families something to talk about while eating. Breakfast strata brought make-ahead convenience to morning meals through layered bread, eggs, cheese, and sausage baked into casserole. This practical creation cost about 75 cents and fed 8 people with breakfast that could be assembled the night before and baked in the morning. Grandmothers made breakfast strata by layering cubed bread with cooked sausage and shredded cheese in a baking dish, pouring beaten eggs mixed with milk over everything, refrigerating overnight to let the bread absorb the egg mixture, then baking until golden and puffy. The overnight soaking ensured every bite was custardy and flavorful. The strata represented 1950s embrace of make-ahead cooking, showing how proper planning could eliminate morning stress while still creating results that were impressive and satisfying. Corned beef hash brought leftover meat to breakfast through corned beef and potatoes fried together until crispy. This economical creation cost about 40 cents when using leftover corned beef, and fed 4 people with breakfast that was substantial and savory. Grandmothers made corned beef hash by chopping leftover corned beef and cooked potatoes, mixing them with diced onions, then frying the mixture in butter or bacon grease until crispy and browned on the bottom. The key was letting it cook undisturbed long enough to develop crispy crust before stirring and allowing another crust to form. The hash taught that the best breakfasts often used leftovers creatively, that crispy texture made food more appealing, and that one-pan cooking created satisfying meals with minimal cleanup. The dish represented practical cooking that wasted nothing and that turned yesterday's dinner into today's breakfast through technique rather than just reheating. 15 breakfasts down, halfway through. Eggs poached in spicy tomato, bread soaking overnight in custard, leftover beef becoming crispy hash, grapefruit warming with honey, fish cakes from salt cod. Your grandmother knew 30 ways to start the day, each one different, each one teaching something about technique, economy, or making mornings special. 15 more recipes complete her breakfast wisdom. Scrapple brought Pennsylvania Dutch tradition to breakfast tables through pork scraps and cornmeal formed into loaf, sliced and fried. Grandmothers made scrapple by simmering pork scraps, head, heart, liver, until tender, removing the meat and chopping it fine, cooking cornmeal in the broth until thick, mixing in the chopped meat and seasonings, pouring into loaf pans to cool and set, then slicing and frying until crispy. The dish represented immigrant foodways maintained through generations. Baked oatmeal squares brought hot cereal to the table in portable form through oats baked with eggs and milk until firm enough to cut into squares. This practical creation cost about 30 cents and created breakfast that could be eaten with hands, making it perfect for children or for eating on the go. Grandmothers made baked oatmeal squares by mixing oats with eggs, milk, butter, brown sugar, and cinnamon, spreading the mixture in a baking pan, and baking until set and golden. The baking created firm texture that was different from stovetop oatmeal, more like oatmeal cookie than porridge. The squares represented 1950s innovation in breakfast preparation, showing how traditional foods could be adapted to modern needs for convenience and portability without sacrificing nutrition or homemade quality. Creamed salmon on toast brought fish to breakfast through canned salmon in white sauce served over toast. This economical creation cost about 45 cents and provided protein that was different from eggs or meat, creating variety in breakfast options. Grandmothers made creamed salmon by making white sauce from butter, flour, and milk, stirring in flaked canned salmon, seasoning with salt, pepper, and sometimes dill, then serving over toast points. The salmon had to be drained well and bones removed, though some grandmothers left the soft bones in for calcium. The dish was similar to creamed chipped beef, but with milder, less salty flavor that some people preferred. The salmon's pink color made the dish more visually appealing than the brown chipped beef, creating prettier presentation. Creamed salmon appeared at breakfast in coastal areas where fish was traditional morning food, and in households where canned salmon was economical protein source. The dish taught that canned fish could be breakfast food, that white sauce could transform many ingredients into elegant dishes, and that variety in breakfast protein sources prevented monotony. The salmon represented 1950s embrace of canned goods as pantry staples, showing how preserved foods made diverse meals possible without daily shopping, and how shelf-stable proteins created flexibility in meal planning. This is the dish the hook promised would show you what breakfast excellence meant. A soufflé omelette requiring separated eggs and precise timing to create fluffy, impressive omelette that was part soufflé, part traditional omelette. Soufflé omelette brought French technique to breakfast through eggs separated and beaten separately before cooking. This impressive creation cost about 30 cents and demonstrated advanced egg cooking skills that separated accomplished cooks from beginners. Grandmothers made soufflé omelette by separating eggs, beating the yolks with seasonings, whipping the whites to stiff peaks, folding the whites into the yolks, then cooking the mixture in a buttered skillet until the bottom set and the top was still slightly soft. The omelette went into the oven briefly to finish cooking the top, creating fluffy, cloud-like texture. The folding technique was critical. Too vigorous and the air deflated, too gentle and streaks of white remained visible. The cooking required attention to prevent burning the bottom before the top cooked through. The timing of when to transfer from stovetop to oven separated successful soufflé omelettes from flat, dense failures. Soufflé omelette appeared at Sunday breakfast or when company stayed overnight, demonstrating that this was special occasion breakfast that warranted extra effort. The dish taught that egg whites could create lightness. That proper technique transformed simple eggs into impressive dish, and that the most elegant breakfasts often required the most skill and attention to detail. Coffee cake brought sweetbread to breakfast through cake enriched with sour cream and topped with cinnamon streusel. This classic creation cost about 60 cents and produced cake that served 12 people, making it practical for weekend breakfasts when family gathered. Grandmothers made coffee cake by creaming butter and sugar, adding eggs and sour cream, mixing in flour and baking powder, pouring half the batter into a pan, sprinkling cinnamon sugar mixture over it, adding remaining batter, topping with streusel made from flour, butter, and brown sugar, then baking until golden. The layers of cinnamon created visual interest when the cake was sliced. The sour cream made the cake tender and moist, creating texture that was more refined than plain cake. The streusel topping added crunch that contrasted with the soft cake, making each bite interesting. Coffee cake could be made the day before and served at room temperature, making it practical for busy mornings when there was no time to bake. The make-ahead quality separated coffee cake from other breakfast breads that had to be served fresh from the oven. Coffee cake appeared at weekend breakfasts and, when company visited, served with coffee as the name suggested. The dish taught that breakfast could include cake, that sour cream created tender texture, and that streusel topping made simple cake seem special and bakery-worthy. 20 breakfasts down, 10 remaining, oatmeal baking into squares, salmon creating elegant toast topping, egg whites beaten into soufflé, sour cream making tender cake, pork scraps becoming Pennsylvania tradition. These weren't just different recipes, they were different philosophies about what breakfast could be. Elegant, economical, portable, impressive, traditional. 10 final recipes complete the collection. Dutch baby pancake brought dramatic presentation to breakfast through a giant pancake baked in the oven until it puffed up spectacularly around the edges. This impressive creation cost about 40 cents and created breakfast that looked like magic had happened, with edges that rose several inches above the pan while the center stayed relatively flat. Grandmothers made Dutch baby by mixing eggs, milk, flour, and sugar into thin batter, thinner than regular pancake batter, more like crepe batter, pouring it into a very hot, buttered cast-iron skillet or baking dish, then baking at very high heat, 425 to 450 degrees, until the pancake rose dramatically around the edges and turned golden brown. The high heat and hot pan were absolutely essential for the dramatic rise that made Dutch baby impressive and memorable. The pancake had to be served immediately from the oven. It deflated within minutes as it cooled, losing the spectacular height that made it special and photo-worthy. This immediate serving requirement meant everyone had to be ready to eat the moment the Dutch baby came out of the oven, creating urgency and excitement that made the breakfast feel like an event. The pancake was traditionally served with powdered sugar and fresh lemon juice squeezed over the top, creating sweet-tart combination that was refreshing and not too heavy. Some grandmothers served it with syrup instead, or with fresh berries when available, creating variations that kept the basic technique interesting. The name sparked curiosity and required explanation. Dutch baby had nothing to do with Holland or babies, but rather came from Deutsch, German, and referred to the pancake's German origins. These naming discussions created educational moments around the breakfast table and demonstrated that food names often had interesting histories worth knowing. Dutch baby appeared at Sunday breakfast or special occasions when the dramatic presentation justified the precise timing required and when grandmothers wanted to create memorable breakfast that impressed. The dish was particularly popular when overnight guests stayed, creating breakfast that was impressive enough to serve to company, but not so complicated that it required hours of preparation. Creamed turkey on waffles brought Thanksgiving leftovers to breakfast through turkey in white sauce served over waffles, creating dish that was both economical and elegant. This creative creation used leftover turkey from holiday dinners and demonstrated how dinner meat could become breakfast through creative transformation. Grandmothers made creamed turkey on waffles by making white sauce from butter, flour, and milk or turkey broth, stirring in chopped leftover turkey, seasoning with salt, pepper, and sometimes sage or thyme, then serving the creamed turkey over freshly made waffles. The waffles provided base that was more interesting than toast and that had pockets that held the sauce perfectly. The white sauce could be made with turkey broth instead of milk, creating more flavorful sauce that tasted like concentrated turkey rather than just cream sauce with turkey added. This use of leftover broth demonstrated complete utilization of the holiday turkey. Meat for eating, bones for broth, broth for sauce. The waffles had to be made fresh that morning, requiring waffle iron and time to cook them individually. The combination of fresh-made waffles and leftover turkey created breakfast that was part fresh, part leftover, demonstrating that the best leftover dishes often combined something new with something reused. Creamed turkey on waffles appeared on the mornings after Thanksgiving and Christmas, when leftover turkey needed using and when families wanted something special for breakfast but didn't want to eat plain reheated turkey. The dish transformed leftovers into something that felt new and different, preventing the leftover fatigue that could set in when eating the same meat for multiple days. Creamed turkey on waffles also taught about strategic leftover use, that planning for leftovers meant thinking about how they could be transformed, that the best leftover dishes were those that created completely different eating experience from the original meal, and that creativity could prevent waste while maintaining interest and variety. The combination of savory creamed turkey and slightly sweet waffles created flavor profile that was interesting and complex, demonstrating that sweet and savory could coexist in single dish and that the most memorable meals often featured unexpected combinations that worked better than expected. Baked eggs with cream brought simple elegance to breakfast through eggs baked in ramekins with heavy cream, creating individual servings that were rich and luxurious. This indulgent creation cost about 50 cents and demonstrated how cream could transform simple eggs into something that seemed expensive and special. Grandmothers made baked eggs with cream by buttering individual ramekins, cracking 1 or 2 eggs into each, pouring heavy cream over the eggs, seasoning with salt and pepper, and baking at moderate temperature until the whites set, but the yolks remained soft and runny. The cream created rich sauce around the eggs that was almost like custard. The timing was absolutely critical. The difference between perfect baked eggs and overcooked ones was about 2 minutes, requiring attention and experience to recognize the exact moment when whites had set, but yolks were still soft. Grandmothers learned to judge doneness by appearance and by gentle shaking of the ramekin, understanding that slight jiggle in the center meant perfect doneness. The eggs were served in the ramekins they were baked in, creating individual servings that looked elegant and restaurant quality. The presentation announced that this was special breakfast, that individual attention had been paid to each serving, and that the cook had invested effort in making breakfast impressive. Some grandmothers added variations, sprinkling cheese over the eggs before baking, or adding cooked bacon or ham to the ramekin before adding the egg, or topping with fresh herbs after baking. These variations created different flavors while maintaining the basic technique, demonstrating that once you mastered the fundamental method, endless variations became possible. Baked eggs with cream appeared at Sunday breakfast or holiday mornings when richness and elegance were appropriate, when grandmothers wanted to create memorable breakfast that felt luxurious and special. The cream made the dish feel indulgent and celebratory, appropriate for occasions when ordinary scrambled eggs seemed too plain and everyday. The dish taught that baked eggs were different from fried or scrambled, that cream created richness that milk couldn't match, that individual servings made simple food seem special through presentation, and that the most elegant breakfasts often featured the simplest preparations executed perfectly. Baked eggs with cream also taught about timing and attention, that some foods had very narrow windows of perfect doneness, that watching carefully and pulling food from heat at exactly the right moment separated excellent results from mediocre ones, and that developing the judgment to recognize perfect doneness came only from repeated practice and accumulated experience. The ramekins themselves represented investment in proper equipment, individual baking dishes that were used primarily for this one dish, but that created results that couldn't be achieved in regular baking pans. This specialized equipment demonstrated that serious cooking sometimes required specialized tools, that investment in proper equipment created better results, and that the best cooks owned tools that allowed them to execute techniques that others couldn't manage. Sausage and egg casserole brought make-ahead convenience to breakfast through sausage, eggs, bread, and cheese baked together into one dish. This practical creation cost about 85 cents and fed 8 to 10 people with breakfast that could be assembled the night before and baked in the morning, creating hot breakfast without morning stress. Grandmothers made sausage and egg casserole by browning pork sausage and breaking it into crumbles, arranging bread cubes in a buttered baking dish, sprinkling the cooked sausage and shredded cheese over the bread, pouring beaten eggs mixed with milk over everything, refrigerating overnight, then baking until golden and puffy. The overnight rest allowed the bread to absorb the egg mixture completely, creating cohesive casserole rather than separate components. The casserole required at least 8 hours of refrigeration before baking to allow proper absorption, making it impractical for same-day preparation, but perfect for holiday mornings when advanced planning was possible. The make-ahead quality meant Christmas morning could be relaxed rather than rushed, allowing grandmothers to sit with family rather than standing at the stove. The sausage had to be cooked completely before adding to the casserole because the baking time wasn't long enough to cook raw sausage safely. This pre-cooking step was essential for food safety and created opportunity to drain excess fat that would otherwise make the casserole greasy. The cheese melted during baking, creating pockets of rich, gooey cheese throughout the casserole that children particularly loved. The cheese also helped bind everything together, creating structural integrity that allowed the casserole to be cut into neat squares for serving. Sausage and egg casserole appeared at Christmas morning and other holiday breakfasts when feeding many people simultaneously mattered. When the cook wanted to participate in present opening rather than missing it while cooking breakfast, and when impressive breakfast needed to be convenient rather than labor-intensive. The casserole taught that breakfast could be convenient without being processed, that advanced planning created relaxed mornings, that one-dish meals could be impressive and satisfying, and that the best holiday breakfasts were those that allowed everyone, including the cook, to enjoy the morning together, rather than having someone isolated in the kitchen. The dish also taught about layering and assembly, that building casseroles in proper order created better results than just throwing everything together, that each component needed proper preparation before assembly, and that understanding how ingredients interacted during baking allowed cooks to create dishes that held together and sliced cleanly rather than falling apart. Sausage and egg casserole represented peak 1950s breakfast convenience. Not convenience from processed foods or mixes, but convenience from smart planning and understanding of how to create impressive results through advanced preparation that allowed relaxed mornings when the actual eating happened. Hash brown casserole brought potatoes to breakfast in casserole form through shredded potatoes baked with cheese, sour cream, and condensed soup. This crowd-pleasing creation cost about 65 cents and fed 10 to 12 people with potatoes that were creamy inside with crispy top, creating texture combination that made simple potatoes seem special. Grandmothers made hash brown casserole by mixing thawed frozen hash browns or freshly shredded potatoes that had been squeezed dry with shredded cheddar cheese, sour cream, condensed cream of chicken soup, melted butter and diced onions, spreading the mixture in a baking dish, topping with crushed cornflakes mixed with melted butter, then baking until golden and bubbly. The combination of creamy interior and crunchy topping created textural interest that made the casserole more appealing than plain fried hash browns. The frozen hash browns represented 1950s embrace of convenience products that saved labor without sacrificing quality. Using frozen, shredded potatoes eliminated the tedious work of shredding and squeezing fresh potatoes while creating results that were nearly identical. This acceptance of helpful convenience products showed that grandmothers weren't rigidly traditional but rather pragmatic about adopting innovations that genuinely improved results or saved labor. The casserole could be assembled the night before and refrigerated until baking time, making it practical for holiday mornings when oven space and timing were already complicated. The make-ahead quality meant one less thing to worry about on busy mornings, creating stress reduction that was valuable beyond just the food itself. The cornflake topping created crunch that contrasted with the creamy potatoes, demonstrating that textural variety made food more interesting and appealing. The topping also created visual appeal. Golden brown surface that announced proper baking and that looked impressive when brought to the table. 25 breakfasts down, 5 remaining. Scrapple from pork scraps. Oatmeal baking into portable squares. Salmon joining white sauce, egg whites creating clouds, casseroles assembling overnight. You've witnessed complete breakfast system, elegant presentations, economical leftovers, make-ahead convenience, traditional techniques, modern adaptations. 5 final recipes reveal the peak of 1950s breakfast culture. Creamed mushrooms on toast brought elegant vegetarian option to breakfast through mushrooms in white sauce served over toast. This sophisticated creation cost about 50 cents and demonstrated that breakfast didn't require eggs or meat to be satisfying and impressive. Grandmothers made creamed mushrooms by slicing fresh mushrooms and sautéing them in butter until they released their liquid and browned slightly, making white sauce in the same pan by sprinkling flour over the mushrooms, cooking briefly, then adding milk or cream while stirring constantly. The mushrooms flavored the sauce as it cooked, creating earthy, rich flavor that was completely different from plain white sauce. The mushrooms had to be cooked properly, not just heated through, but actually browned to develop deep, complex flavor. This browning step separated excellent creamed mushrooms from mediocre ones, demonstrating that even simple ingredients like mushrooms required proper technique to reach their full potential. The sauce had to be thick enough to coat the mushrooms and cling to the toast without running off, requiring proper thickening and attention to consistency. The thickness also prevented the toast from becoming soggy, maintaining textural contrast between crispy toast and creamy topping. Creamed mushrooms on toast appeared at Sunday breakfast or holiday mornings when something elegant and different was wanted, when grandmothers wanted to demonstrate that breakfast could be sophisticated without being complicated, and when vegetarian options were needed for family members who didn't eat meat. The dish taught that mushrooms could be breakfast food, that vegetables could be main component rather than just side dish, that white sauce was versatile base that worked with many ingredients, and that elegant breakfasts didn't require expensive ingredients, just proper technique and understanding of how to develop flavor through browning and proper seasoning. Creamed mushrooms also taught about umami. Though grandmothers didn't use that term, they understood that mushrooms provided savory depth that made dishes satisfying without meat, that certain vegetables had meaty quality that made them substantial, and that proper cooking developed this quality, while improper cooking left it underdeveloped. The dish represented 1950s sophistication in breakfast cooking, showing that home cooks could create restaurant-quality dishes, that breakfast could feature ingredients and techniques that seemed fancy and special, and that the most impressive meals often came from simple ingredients that were properly prepared rather than from expensive ingredients that were carelessly cooked. Baked tomatoes with eggs brought garden vegetables to breakfast through tomatoes halved, topped with eggs, and baked until the eggs set. This fresh creation cost about 40 cents during tomato season and created breakfast that was colorful, nutritious, and completely different from standard egg preparations. Grandmothers made baked tomatoes with eggs by cutting large, firm tomatoes in half, scooping out some of the seeds to create deeper cavity, seasoning the tomato halves with salt and pepper, cracking an egg into each tomato half, topping with a little cream and grated cheese, then baking until the eggs set and the tomatoes softened. The tomato provided edible bowl that flavored the egg as it cooked. The tomatoes had to be large and firm enough to hold their shape during baking. Soft, overripe tomatoes collapsed and created mess rather than neat individual servings. The variety choice mattered, with beefsteak tomatoes being ideal because of their size and firm flesh. The timing required attention because eggs and tomatoes cooked at different rates. The tomatoes needed longer to soften, while the eggs needed shorter time to set without overcooking. The balance required judgment and experience, with grandmothers learning to recognize when both components had reached perfect doneness simultaneously. The cream and cheese added richness that made the dish more substantial and satisfying, transforming what could have been light breakfast into something filling enough to sustain through morning. The cheese melted and browned slightly, creating golden topping that announced proper baking. Baked tomatoes with eggs appeared primarily during summer and early fall, when fresh tomatoes were abundant and at their peak flavor. The seasonal nature made them anticipated treat rather than year-round option, creating excitement when tomato season arrived and making the dish memorable rather than routine. The dish taught that vegetables could be breakfast main course, that tomatoes were versatile beyond just salads and sauces, that seasonal eating meant matching foods to their peak availability, and that the best breakfasts often featured fresh, seasonal ingredients that were at their flavor peak. Baked tomatoes with eggs also taught about individual servings and presentation, that giving each person their own tomato egg cup created special feeling that communal dishes couldn't match, that individual attention made people feel valued and cared for, and that presentation mattered as much as taste in creating memorable meals. The dish represented 1950s garden-to-table cooking before that phrase existed, showing how families with gardens could create special meals from homegrown ingredients, how seasonal abundance could be celebrated through creative preparations, and how the freshest ingredients needed minimal preparation to shine because their inherent quality was the star. Shirred eggs with bacon brought individual servings to breakfast through eggs baked in small dishes with cream, butter, and bacon. This elegant creation cost about 50 cents and created breakfast that looked restaurant quality despite simple preparation. Grandmothers made shirred eggs with bacon by lining individual ramekins with partially cooked bacon strips, cracking eggs into the bacon-lined dishes, adding a spoonful of cream and a dot of butter on top, seasoning with salt and pepper, then baking until the whites set, but the yolks remained soft and runny. The bacon cooked completely during baking while flavoring the eggs. Ramekins created individual servings that made each person feel specially attended to, demonstrating that breakfast could feature the same kind of individual plating that fancy dinners used. The presentation elevated simple eggs and bacon into something that seemed sophisticated and refined. The timing was critical. Overbaked eggs had hard yolks that were unpleasant and that announced the cook didn't understand proper timing, while underbaked eggs had runny whites that were unappealing and potentially unsafe. The narrow window of perfect doneness required attention and understanding of how eggs behaved in the oven. The bacon lining the ramekin created edible bowl that held the egg and provided smoky, salty flavor that complemented the rich, creamy egg. The bacon also created visual interest, with its red-brown color contrasting against the white egg and yellow yolk. Shirred eggs with bacon appeared at Sunday breakfast or holiday mornings, when individual servings and elegant presentation mattered, when grandmothers wanted to create memorable breakfast that impressed overnight guests or made family feel special. The dish demonstrated that ordinary ingredients could be transformed into something impressive through proper technique and thoughtful presentation. The dish taught that individual servings created special feeling, that baked eggs were different from fried or scrambled, that cream and butter created richness that elevated simple ingredients, and that the most impressive breakfasts often came from simple preparations that were executed perfectly rather than from complicated recipes that were executed carelessly. Shirred eggs also taught about equipment, that owning individual ramekins allowed for presentations that weren't possible with regular dishes, that investing in proper equipment created opportunities for dishes that impressed, and that the best cooks owned specialized tools that enabled techniques and presentations that others couldn't achieve. The dish represented 1950s aspiration toward sophistication and refinement in home cooking, showing that housewives and grandmothers could create restaurant-quality presentations, that breakfast could be as carefully plated as dinner, and that home cooking could rival professional cooking when proper technique and attention to detail were applied. Eggs Benedict casserole transformed the classic individual dish into make-ahead casserole that fed many people simultaneously. This innovative creation cost about $1.25 and demonstrated how restaurant dishes could be adapted for home use and for feeding crowds rather than plating individually. Grandmothers made eggs Benedict casserole by arranging English muffin halves in a baking dish, topping them with ham or Canadian bacon, pouring beaten eggs mixed with milk over everything, refrigerating overnight, then baking until set and topping with hollandaise sauce just before serving. The casserole format eliminated the need to poach eggs individually and allowed one dish to feed 8 to 10 people. Hollandaise sauce was still made from scratch, egg yolks, butter, lemon juice, but was made in larger quantity and poured over the entire casserole rather than being carefully placed on individual servings. This adaptation maintained the essential character of Eggs Benedict while making it practical for feeding groups. The casserole had to be assembled at least 8 hours before baking to allow the English muffins to absorb the egg mixture properly. This overnight rest was essential. Without it, the muffins stayed dry and the eggs didn't integrate with the other components, creating separated dish rather than cohesive casserole. The timing of when to add the hollandaise was critical. It had to be made fresh that morning and added just before serving because hollandaise couldn't be made ahead or reheated. This last-minute component meant the casserole wasn't completely make-ahead, but preparing the hollandaise was faster than poaching individual eggs and assembling individual servings. Eggs Benedict casserole appeared at holiday breakfasts and brunches when feeding many people mattered, when grandmothers wanted to serve something impressive but didn't want to spend the morning assembling individual plates. The casserole demonstrated that fancy dishes could be adapted for practical home use, that restaurant techniques could be modified for crowd feeding, and that maintaining the essential character while adapting the format was possible when you understood what made the dish special. The dish taught that individual dishes could be transformed into casseroles, that make-ahead convenience could be combined with impressive results, that understanding the essential elements of a dish allowed for creative adaptation, and that the best home cooking often involved taking restaurant dishes and modifying them to be more practical for home use while maintaining their appeal. Eggs Benedict casserole also taught about adaptation and innovation, that respecting classic dishes didn't require rigid adherence to original format, that understanding why dishes worked allowed for creative modifications, and that the most successful recipe adaptations maintained essential character while improving practicality. Overnight coffee cake completed the collection by demonstrating that the best breakfast breads were often those that required advance planning, that patience created superior results, and that thinking ahead made mornings easier and more relaxed. Overnight coffee cake brought convenience to holiday mornings through yeast-raised sweet bread that was assembled the night before, refrigerated to rise slowly overnight, then baked in the morning. This practical creation cost about 70 cents and produced cake that served 12 to 14 people with breakfast bread that was tender, flavorful, and impressive, despite requiring minimal morning work. Grandmothers made overnight coffee cake by preparing yeast dough enriched with butter, eggs, and sugar, spreading it in a baking pan, topping it with cinnamon sugar mixture and streusel topping, covering it, and refrigerating overnight. The cold temperature slowed the yeast's activity, creating very slow rise that developed flavor while allowing the dough to be ready for baking in the morning without requiring early morning dough preparation. The overnight rise was essential for both flavor and convenience. The slow fermentation developed complex flavor that quick-rise cakes lacked, while the advanced preparation meant the cake just needed baking in the morning rather than requiring hours of mixing, rising, and assembling. This combination of superior flavor and practical convenience made overnight coffee cake ideal for holiday mornings. The dough had to be properly covered during refrigeration to prevent drying and to contain the rise, even in cold temperatures. Yeast remained somewhat active, and the dough expanded slowly overnight. Grandmothers learned to use pans large enough to accommodate this slow rise without the dough overflowing. The morning baking filled the house with smell of cinnamon and yeast, creating sensory experience that woke everyone pleasantly and announced that something special was happening. The smell was part of the experience, creating anticipation and making the breakfast memorable before anyone even tasted the cake. Overnight coffee cake appeared at Christmas morning and other holiday breakfasts when impressive results were wanted, but when morning time was limited by other activities like present opening or church services. The cake demonstrated that advance planning created relaxed mornings, that the best results often came from slow processes rather than rushed ones, and that convenience and quality could coexist when proper techniques were used. The cake taught that yeast baking didn't have to be intimidating or time-consuming on the day of serving, that cold fermentation was powerful technique that developed flavor while providing convenience, that planning ahead created better results and less stress, and that the most successful holiday cooking often involved strategic timing that distributed work across multiple days rather than cramming everything into one overwhelming day. Overnight coffee cake represented everything these 30 breakfasts demonstrated: that morning meals deserved care and planning, that breakfast could be impressive without being difficult, that advanced preparation created relaxed mornings, that technique and timing mattered as much as ingredients, and that the best breakfasts were those that allowed the cook to enjoy the morning alongside everyone else rather than being isolated in the kitchen while others gathered. The cake completed the collection by showing that breakfast excellence came from understanding timing, planning, technique, and the belief that morning meals mattered enough to justify the thought and effort that created results that were memorable, satisfying, and that started every day, especially special days, with care and attention that announced that the people being fed were valued and loved. Which of these 30 Betty Crocker breakfast recipes did your grandmother make in the 1950s? Comment the recipe name and your state. I'm mapping where these breakfast traditions persisted longest and which regions abandoned them first as convenience foods replaced from-scratch morning cooking that defined how families started their days. If you made it through all 30 recipes, you understand that 1950s grandmothers weren't just making breakfast. They were creating morning rituals that brought families together around the table, demonstrating that the day's first meal deserved the same care and attention as dinner, and proving that breakfast excellence required skills and knowledge that went far beyond just scrambling eggs or pouring cereal from a box. They mastered techniques that required years of practice and understanding that couldn't be learned from written recipes alone, skills that developed only through repeated experience and careful attention to subtle cues. Making smooth white sauce without lumps required knowing exactly when to add milk to the roux, understanding the right whisking motion, and recognizing the moment when the sauce would seize if you stopped stirring. Timing baked eggs so yolks stayed soft while whites set completely demanded understanding your oven's actual temperature versus what the dial claimed, knowing how carryover heat would continue cooking after removal, and recognizing the subtle visual cues that indicated doneness. Beating egg whites to proper stiffness meant feeling the resistance change in your arm as you whisked, seeing the exact moment when peaks held their shape but hadn't yet become dry and grainy, and understanding how temperature and bowl material affected the process. Coordinating multiple components so everything finished simultaneously required mental timing that accounted for each dish's preparation and cooking duration, for the ways some foods could wait while others couldn't, and for the reality that nothing ever took exactly the time recipes claimed.